The universe, in its infinite wisdom and equally infinite capacity for irony, had developed a rather neat little classification system for worlds that produced sentient life. Not that anyone had asked the universe's opinion, mind you, but cosmic forces rarely waited for permission before implementing their more entertaining schemes. At the bottom of this delightfully morbid scale sat the Class 1 worlds, pleasant little garden paradises, where the most dangerous predator might be a particularly aggressive flower that bloomed too loudly. The inhabitants of such worlds typically evolved with all the survival instincts of a particularly optimistic houseplant, which worked out splendidly for them, since their biggest daily concern was whether the morning dew contained sufficient minerals. Then you had your various middle-tier classifications, each progressively more unpleasant than the last. Class 6 worlds produced beings that had to worry about things like acid rain and carnivorous vegetation. Class 9 inhabitants dealt with gravity that could crush bones and atmospheric pressure that would liquefy lesser species' internal organs, perfectly reasonable environmental challenges that any sensible evolutionary process could work with, given a few million years and a decent sense of humor about the whole thing. And then, at the very tippy top of this charming little hierarchy, you had the Class 12 Deathworlds. Class 12 worlds were where the universe apparently decided to experiment with the concept of what if everything was trying to kill you, but in creative ways. These were planets where the weather had moods, the local fauna treated survival as a competitive sport, and the very ground beneath your feet might decide to suddenly become not ground at the most inconvenient possible moment. The Cytherian supremacy, bless their militaristically inclined hearts, had built their entire galactic empire on a rather simple premise. If you could survive on a tougher world than your neighbors, you were obviously superior to them in every meaningful way, and therefore had the cosmic right to tell them what to do. It was a philosophy that had worked remarkably well for them, considering they hailed from Kytha Prime, a lovely Class 11 world where the local equivalent of butterflies had evolved razor-sharp wing edges and a taste for anything containing hemoglobin. For the past 3,000 years, the Cytherians had systematically conquered, absorbed, or diplomatically convinced every other spacefaring species they'd encountered. Their secret was beautifully simple. They challenged the leadership of any new species to single combat. Their apex commander would demonstrate the superior evolutionary advantages that came from Class 11 survival training, and within a few impressively bloody minutes, they'd have themselves another vassal species. Apex Commander Zethkalar was the current holder of this prestigious position, and he wore the title with all the humble grace of a supernova in a Firefly convention. Standing nearly 3 meters tall when he bothered to fully extend his segmented spine, Zethkalar possessed 4 arms that ended in claws capable of rending durasteel, compound eyes that could track movement in spectrums that most species couldn't even perceive, and an exoskeleton that had deflected everything from plasma bolts to small asteroids. He had personally defeated the champions of 47 different species, and his trophy collection was the sort of thing that made hardened veterans wake up in cold sweats. The Rigelian Hive Queen's mandibles, the ceremonial combat claws of the Andromedan pack leader, the crystalline thinking organ of the vegan crystal dancer's eldest sage. Each victory had been recorded, catalogued, and broadcast across the known galaxy, as a gentle reminder of exactly where everyone stood in the grand cosmic pecking order, which brought us to today's little gathering aboard Kepler-7, a diplomatically neutral space station that orbited absolutely nothing in particular, making it the perfect spot for the sort of delicate negotiations that might result in either a trade agreement or several new decorations for someone's trophy wall. The Cytherians had recently encountered a new species, and initial reports were amusing. These newcomers called themselves humans, and they claimed to represent something called the Terran Federation. Standard first contact protocols had been followed: cultural exchanges, technological assessments, the usual song and dance that preceded either peaceful coexistence or systematic subjugation. What made this particular encounter interesting was the classification data that had come back from the survey teams. Terra was a Class 12 death world. Now, this should have been cause for considerable alarm among the Cytherian hierarchy. In 3,000 years of galactic conquest, they had never encountered another species that had evolved on a world rated higher than Class 10. The mathematical probability of two Class 11 or higher species evolving in the same galactic neighborhood was supposed to be roughly equivalent to the chance of spontaneously developing the ability to taste the color purple. But Zaith-Kalar, blessed with the sort of supreme confidence that comes from 3 centuries of never losing a fight, had looked at the data and laughed. Class 12 or not, these humans were obviously some sort of cosmic joke. They were small, barely 2 meters tall at their largest. They had only 2 arms, 2 eyes, and their skin looked like it might tear if exposed to a stiff breeze. They didn't even have proper claws, just soft little appendages with what appeared to be decorative calcium deposits at the tips. Most tellingly, they had sent a female as their primary negotiator. Not that Zaith-Kalar had anything against females in positions of authority. Etherian society was refreshingly egalitarian when it came to who got to eviscerate whom in ritualized combat. But among his species, diplomatic negotiations were traditionally handled by the largest, most intimidating individuals available, specifically because these talks had a tendency to end with someone's internal organs being redistributed around the room. The fact that these humans had sent what appeared to be a relatively small, soft-looking female suggested either complete ignorance of galactic diplomatic norms or a level of arrogance that would be genuinely impressive if it weren't about to get their representative messily killed. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was, by human standards, exactly the sort of person you'd want representing your species in delicate interstellar negotiations. She possessed the kind of calm competence that came from spending 15 years in the Terran diplomatic corps, dealing with everything from trade disputes to territorial conflicts, to that one memorable incident involving the Centurion ambassador's unfortunate allergic reaction to human cologne. She was also, though the assembled alien delegations couldn't have known this, a graduate of the Terran Special Operations Academy, holder of advanced certifications in 17 different forms of unarmed combat, and the current record holder for survival time in the Australian Continental Reserve, a nature preserve that Terra maintained specifically for the purpose of keeping its more enthusiastic flora and fauna from getting bored. But to the various alien species gathered in Kepler-7's main conference chamber, she looked like a walking, talking example of evolutionary failure. She was small, appeared to have no natural weapons, and moved with the sort of casual, unhurried gait that suggested she had never encountered a genuine predator in her entire life. The Regalian delegate actually chittered with amusement when she entered the room. The Andromedan pack leader's ears flattened against his skull in what his species considered polite confusion. The vegan crystal dancer's entire crystalline structure shifted to a color that roughly translated to second-hand embarrassment. Zaith-Kalar simply smiled, which was the sort of expression that had historically preceded several dozen species learning important lessons about the food chain. "So," he said, his translator rendering his subsonic rumbles into perfectly polite galactic standard, "the mighty Terran Federation sends us this." Elena took her seat at the negotiating table with the sort of unhurried precision that could have been either supreme confidence or complete obliviousness to the danger she was in. She opened her briefcase, removed a data tablet, and consulted it briefly before looking up at the assembled delegates. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the warm professionalism of someone discussing quarterly earnings reports rather than potential interstellar war, "shall we begin?" The next hour proceeded exactly as every other first contact negotiation in Kytherian history had proceeded. Territorial boundaries were discussed. Trade agreements were proposed, rejected, and counter-proposed. The humans wanted access to certain galactic shipping routes. The Kytherians wanted exclusive mining rights to 17 different star systems that the Terran Federation had recently surveyed. It was all very civilized, right up until the moment Zaith-Kalar decided he was bored. "Enough," he said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of something that had evolved to kill things efficiently. "This pretense grows tedious." Elena looked up from her data tablet with the mild interest of someone whose afternoon meeting had just taken an unexpected turn. "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure I understand. Which pretense are we discussing? The pretense that your species belongs in this conference chamber as anything other than a tributary state," Zaith-Kalar replied, extending himself to his full height. "The pretense that a soft little creature from a Class 12 world could possibly stand as an equal to the representatives of the Kytherian supremacy." The other delegates began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. recognizing the signs of an impending demonstration. They had all been through this process before, when their own species had first encountered the Kytherians. First came the polite diplomatic overtures, then the increasingly aggressive territorial displays, and finally the inevitable challenge that would end with their strongest warrior becoming another trophy on Szeth Kalar's wall. Lena, however, simply leaned back in her chair and regarded the Apex commander with the sort of polite attention that one might give to a particularly interesting lecture on soil composition. "I see," she said. "And how would you like to resolve this pretense?" "Single combat," Szeth Kalar declared, his forearms spreading wide in a gesture that had intimidated countless species across the galaxy. "Your strongest warrior against the Apex commander of the Kytherian supremacy. When I have finished demonstrating the natural order of things, your species will take its proper place as a vassal state, and we can proceed with more productive negotiations." "I understand," Elena said, and stood up from her chair. This was the moment when Szeth Kalar expected her to call for backup, or request time to contact her superiors, or perhaps simply begin the sort of desperate pleading that many species attempted before accepting their inevitable defeat. Instead, she walked around the conference table to stand directly in front of him, looked up at his towering form and said, "I accept." The silence that followed was the sort of profound quiet that typically preceded either enlightenment or considerable violence. "You accept?" Szeth Kalar asked, his translator struggling slightly with the incredulous harmonics in his voice. "Of course," Elena replied. "You've issued a formal challenge according to traditional Kytherian diplomatic protocols. As the senior Terran representative present, I'm authorized to respond on behalf of my species. Shall we proceed?" Szeth Kalar stared down at her for a long moment, trying to process this unexpected development. In 3 centuries of issuing challenges, no species had ever accepted immediately. There were usually protests, demands for clarification, desperate attempts to negotiate alternative solutions. The immediate acceptance was so far outside his experience that he briefly wondered if the translator was malfunctioning. "You do understand," he said slowly, "that this is a fight to the death?" "Yes," Elena said. "And you are aware that I have defeated the champions of 47 different species?" "I am." "And you still wish to proceed?" "I do." Szeth Kalar looked around the conference chamber at the other delegates, seeking some sign that this was an elaborate joke or cultural misunderstanding. The Regalian was vibrating with what might have been excitement or terror. The Andromedan's ears were flat against his skull in an expression of absolute bewilderment. The vegan crystal dancer had shifted to a color that didn't translate into any known emotion. "Very well," Szeth Kalar said finally. "Let us adjourn to the combat arena." Kepler 7's combat arena was a standard diplomatic facility designed to accommodate the ritualized violence that so often accompanied interstellar negotiations. It was a simple circular chamber with reinforced walls, variable gravity controls, and atmospheric processors that could accommodate the breathing requirements of most known species. The assembled delegates took their seats in the observation gallery, their conversations reduced to nervous whispers as they watched the 2 combatants enter the arena. Szeth Kalar strode to the center of the chamber with the confident gait of someone who had done this many times before. Elena walked to her position with the same unhurried precision she had displayed throughout the negotiations. "Are you prepared?" asked the automated referee system. "I am ready," Szeth Kalar declared, dropping into a combat stance that showcased the full, intimidating scope of his evolutionary advantages. "Ready," Elena said, and did absolutely nothing. She didn't drop into a fighting stance, she didn't draw any weapons. She didn't even shift her weight or change her breathing pattern. She simply stood there, hands at her sides, looking for all the world like someone waiting for a particularly slow elevator. Szeth Kalar paused, momentarily confused by this complete lack of preparation. In his experience, even the most outmatched opponents usually attempted some sort of defensive posture before the inevitable slaughter began. "Begin combat," announced the referee system. What happened next was the sort of thing that combat analysts would spend decades trying to understand, frame by frame, millisecond by millisecond. Szeth Kalar launched himself forward with the explosive speed that had made him legendary throughout the galaxy. His claws extended to their full razor-sharp length, his compound eyes locked onto what he calculated to be Elena's most vulnerable points, and his forearms moved in the sort of coordinated attack pattern that had previously reduced 47 different species champions to their component molecules. Elena didn't move. She didn't dodge, didn't block, didn't even flinch. She simply stood there, watching Zethkalar's approach with the same mild interest she had shown throughout their earlier conversation. For exactly 2.7 seconds of Zethkalar's charge, this appeared to be the shortest diplomatic combat in galactic history. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything changed. Elena's hand moved. It wasn't a dramatic movement. There was no wind-up, no telegraphing, no visible preparation. Her right hand simply went from hanging at her side to being exactly where Zethkalar's primary attack was going to arrive. And when the two forces met, the Apex Commander discovered several important facts about human evolutionary biology that had been omitted from the initial survey reports. First, humans had evolved on a world where the local gravity was approximately 1.3 times what most species considered standard. This meant that Elena's bones were significantly denser than anyone had calculated. Her muscle fibers were wound considerably tighter than appeared possible, and her reflexes had been honed by millions of years of ancestors who had survived by being just a little bit faster than whatever was trying to eat them. Second, Terra was a world where the local fauna included creatures that could strike with the speed of lightning, the force of industrial machinery, and the precision of laser-guided weapons systems. Humans had not only survived in this environment, they had eventually climbed to the top of the food chain by developing the ability to predict, react to, and counter attacks that moved faster than most species could even perceive. Third, the Terran Special Operations Academy did not consider someone fully trained until they could successfully engage and defeat multiple opponents who were larger, stronger, and better armed than they were, using nothing but their bare hands and whatever improvised weapons happened to be available. Elena's palm strike connected with Zethkalar's center of mass exactly 3.2 seconds into his charge, delivering approximately 847 pounds of precisely directed force to a point that human anatomical experts had calculated would cause maximum systemic disruption to Kytherian physiology. The Apex Commander's forward momentum stopped, as if he had collided with a wall made of crystallized space-time. His compound eyes bulged with shock and sudden, overwhelming pain. His forearms, which had been poised to deliver death from multiple angles, suddenly forgot their coordination and began flailing independently. Elena stepped sideways, allowing Zethkalar's now uncontrolled mass to hurtle past her, and delivered a second strike to what human medical databases had identified as the Kytherian equivalent of a solar plexus. Zethkalar hit the arena floor with the sort of impact that registered on seismic sensors 3 decks away. Elena stood over his twitching form for exactly 4.7 seconds, during which time the assembled delegates experienced the sort of profound cognitive dissonance that typically accompanied witnessing the fundamental laws of physics being casually violated. Then she knelt down, placed 2 fingers against what she correctly identified as Zethkalar's primary pulse point, and nodded with satisfaction. "Feel live," she announced to the observation gallery. "Though he's going to have some impressive bruises for the next few weeks." The silence that followed was the kind of absolute quiet that exists in the space between stars, broken only by the soft wheeze of Zethkalar's attempts to remember how breathing was supposed to work. Finally, the Regillian delegate managed to produce a sound that the translator interpreted as "how." Elena looked up at the observation gallery with the patient expression of someone explaining a relatively simple concept to particularly slow students. "Humans," she said, "evolved as persistence hunters on a world where everything was trying to kill us. We developed the ability to track prey across vast distances, predict their behavior patterns, and outlast them through sheer stubborn endurance. We learned to read micro-expressions, body language, and behavioral tells that allowed us to anticipate attacks before they happened." She stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her diplomatic uniform. Commander Zethkalar telegraphed his entire attack sequence approximately 4 seconds before he executed it. His stance, his breathing pattern, his eye movements, and the way he distributed his weight all provided a comprehensive blueprint of exactly how he was going to move, when he was going to move, and where his strikes were going to land. The Andromedan pack leader's ears were now flat against his skull in an expression that translated roughly to existential terror. "But the speed," he began, "was well within normal human reaction parameters. Elena said calmly. "I've sparred with training partners who move considerably faster. Commander Zeth Kalar's attack was quite impressive by galactic standards, but it wouldn't have qualified him for intermediate-level courses at our combat academy." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I should mention that I'm not actually a combat specialist. My primary training is in interstellar law and diplomatic protocol. Our actual warriors are considerably more capable." This was the moment when the assembled delegates began to understand that they had been operating under some fundamental misconceptions about the nature of Class 12 Deathworlds and the sort of creatures they produced. The vegan crystal dancer had shifted to a color that roughly translated to philosophical crisis. The Rigelian was vibrating at a frequency that suggested he was either terrified or attempting to phase into another dimension. The Andromedan pack leader was making the sort of low whining noise that his species typically reserved for encountering natural disasters. Elena walked back to her position at the conference table, opened her briefcase and consulted her data tablet. "Now then," she said, "shall we continue with our negotiations? I believe we were discussing mineral rights in the Kepler 442 system." The next 3 hours of diplomatic talks proceeded with a level of politeness and mutual cooperation that was completely unprecedented in Catherian history. Trade agreements were reached with remarkable speed, territorial boundaries were established with stunning efficiency. Several long-standing galactic disputes were resolved through what could only be described as enthusiastic compromise. Zeth Kalar, once he had recovered enough to speak coherently, proved to be a surprisingly reasonable negotiator when he wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. It was amazing how much more flexible the Catherian position became once they understood that their traditional approach to diplomacy might result in their apex commander being folded into interesting geometric shapes. As the formal signing ceremony concluded, Elena gathered her materials with the same unhurried precision she had displayed throughout the entire encounter. "This has been quite productive," she said to the assembled delegates. "I'll forward these agreements to my superiors, and we should have ratification within the standard diplomatic time frame." "Ambassador," said the Rigelian delegate, his translator working overtime to render his species' concept of bewildered respect into galactic standard, "may I ask, what would have happened if you had actually been trying to hurt Commander Zeth Kalar?" Elena paused in her packing, considering the question with the thoughtful expression of someone performing complex mathematical calculations. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose we would have needed a significantly more powerful cleaning system for the arena." She closed her briefcase with a soft click that somehow managed to sound ominous. "You gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. I look forward to our continued diplomatic relations." As Elena left the conference chamber, the assembled delegates sat in contemplative silence, each processing the implications of what they had just witnessed. The Catherian supremacy, the dominant military force in the known galaxy for 3,000 years, had just discovered that they were no longer at the top of the food chain. More importantly, they had discovered that the new apex predators were the sort of creatures who would politely negotiate trade agreements rather than simply conquering everyone they met, which was either very good news or very bad news depending on how one felt about the concept of living in a universe where the most dangerous species was also the most reasonable. Zeth Kalar, still nursing his bruises, looked around the conference chamber at his fellow delegates and experienced what human psychologists would have recognized as a moment of genuine enlightenment. "I believe," he said slowly, "that we may need to revise our approach to galactic diplomacy." The Andromedan pack leader's ears perked up slightly. "What do you suggest?" "Perhaps," Zeth Kalar said, his translator conveying a note of what might have been wonder, "we could try asking politely." And thus began what galactic historians would eventually record as the most peaceful era in known interstellar history, largely because everyone was suddenly very interested in staying on the good side of the species that could end fights before they started and still have time to file the proper diplomatic paperwork. The universe, watching this development unfold with the sort of cosmic satisfaction that comes from a plan finally coming together, settled back to observe what would happen when a galaxy full of warriors discovered that the most dangerous predators in known space preferred negotiation to conquest. Of course, the immediate aftermath of Elena's little demonstration produced the sort of bureaucratic chaos that typically accompanied paradigm shifts of this magnitude. Within hours of the conference's conclusion, emergency sessions were being called in capital cities across 17 different star systems. Military advisors who had spent their entire careers studying Cytherian combat techniques suddenly found themselves scrambling to acquire any available data on human physiology, psychology, and tactical doctrine. The Regalian Hive Queen, upon receiving the initial reports, reportedly spent 3 full days in what her species called contemplative silence, which was roughly equivalent to a human having an extended nervous breakdown while maintaining perfect posture. The Andromedan pack leader's first response was to immediately order a comprehensive review of every military engagement his species had ever recorded, searching for any tactical approach that might prove effective against opponents who could predict attacks before they happened. Meanwhile, the vegan crystal dancers' collective consciousness experienced what their philosophers would later describe as the Great Recalibration, a species-wide moment of recognition that their carefully constructed theories about galactic power structures had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. But perhaps the most telling response came from the Cytherian High Command itself. Within 6 standard hours of receiving Szeth Kalar's report, they had quietly begun drafting new diplomatic protocols that emphasized collaborative problem-solving and mutually beneficial outcomes, rather than the traditional approach of submit or be destroyed. This sudden shift toward peaceful resolution wasn't entirely motivated by newfound philosophical enlightenment, of course. When your species had built its entire identity around being the toughest predators in the galaxy, discovering that you were actually somewhere in the middle of the food chain required some serious psychological adjustment. What made the situation particularly fascinating from an anthropological perspective was how quickly the various species began rationalizing Elena's victory. The Cytherians, unable to accept that their champion had been defeated by superior skill alone, initially convinced themselves that humans must possess some form of technological enhancement that allowed them to move faster than physics should permit. This theory lasted approximately 48 hours, until independent medical scans confirmed that Elena was in fact entirely biological and operating within the normal parameters of human physiology. The realization that she had defeated Szeth Kalar using nothing but natural reflexes and training was somehow even more disturbing than the possibility of hidden technology. The Andromedan pack leader spent considerable time reviewing the arena recordings, trying to identify the exact moment when Elena had gained the advantage. His military analysts eventually concluded that she had been reading Szeth Kalar's intentions from the moment they entered the combat arena, possibly even from their initial meeting in the conference chamber. She knew, he reported to his superiors with the sort of awed confusion typically reserved for religious experiences. She knew exactly what he was going to do, and she let him do it anyway. This revelation led to what galactic intelligence services would later classify as the Great Human Study, a coordinated effort by multiple species to understand exactly what sort of evolutionary pressures had produced creatures capable of such precise combat prediction. The results were both illuminating and deeply unsettling. Terra, it turned out, was not just another Class 12 Deathworld. It was a Class 12 Deathworld where the primary survival strategy had evolved not around becoming bigger, stronger, or more heavily armored, but around becoming smarter, more adaptable, and more capable of reading environmental and behavioral cues. Humans had survived by learning to think 3 moves ahead of everything that was trying to kill them. They had developed the ability to recognize patterns, predict outcomes, and adapt their strategies in real time based on microscopic changes in their opponent's behavior. In other words, they had evolved into natural-born tactical geniuses who specialized in defeating opponents who were theoretically superior to them in every measurable way. The implications of this discovery rippled through galactic society like a shockwave through crystalline structures. Military academies began revising their curricula to include courses on predictive combat analysis. Diplomatic corps across dozens of worlds started recruiting individuals with backgrounds in psychology and behavioral analysis. Even civilian educational systems began emphasizing pattern recognition and strategic thinking as core survival skills. It was, the universe reflected, going to be absolutely fascinating to watch.